Yes, hello once again, and thanks for joining me here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we try our very best to rediscover more of those vintage off-roaders from our racing past. Now, just a little heads up as to what's coming up here on CDB TV in the next few weeks. Now, next weekend, that's the 5th of June, we will be taking in round 3 of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2022 Championship, and of course 2 weeks after that we'll be heading to Dumfries in the south of Scotland to cover the 3-day classic racing extravaganza that's to be held at the world famous Drumlandrig Castle. And don't forget, you can see all of the bikes and the racing from both of these events here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. So if you haven't already subscribed, maybe now would be a good time to do that in order that you don't miss out on these couple of up and coming events. So right now we're going to take a look at another lovely little bike from the Peter Maxwell collection, and so without any further delay, let's jump straight into that video and take a look at Peter's lovely 1974 TM100 Suzuki. Now, back in those golden years of the 1970s, off-roading and dirt bike racing in general was at an all-time high, and it seemed that every young person wanted or had dreams of owning and racing one of the many Japanese bikes that were currently available. Now, schoolboy racing in particular was very popular in the early 1970s, and it was around that time that Suzuki then decided to grab a share of the then lucrative schoolboy market and build a bike that was purely aimed at getting young riders interested in Suzuki off-roaders. And of course, Suzuki's other plan was that if they could encourage these younger riders to buy these smaller capacity motocrossers, then as they got older they would hopefully continue to purchase the larger capacity motocross machines from the Suzuki range. Which brings us to our featured TM100, which is a 1974 bike, but others have commented in the past that it may even be a 1975 machine. But either way, this bike here is another example from the Peter Maxwell collection, and if you're a regular visitor to Classic Dirt Bike TV, then you may remember that we featured Peter's 1989 GM500 Myco not so long ago. Now, this lovely example of a TM100 is a bike that Peter said came direct from the USA. Now, Peter hasn't done anything to this bike since he bought it, and the little Suzuki is in exactly the very same condition he received it. Although whether the bike is totally original or has been restored in the past, I'm not really sure, but it certainly looks period correct from that early 1970s era. But basically, these smaller TM100s were just the older TM125s with a smaller bore motor. Although if you were of schoolboy age in 1974, then you were certainly a very lucky kid if you could own or even race one of these little Suzukis, because they were relatively light with a dry weight of, I think it was around 187 pounds at the time, and they did have a good strong 2-stroke motor, and of course not to mention that they looked fantastic in their yellow and black livery. And so as we take a quick look at the Suzuki 100cc or a 98cc motor, if you want to be totally accurate, which was just a simple 2-stroke motor that was fed its fuel through a VM22SC Mikuni carburetor. Now, it also had a standard wet multi-plate clutch and of course a folding kickstarter just to enable you to fire that motor into life. Now, as I remember, these TMs did have a 5-speed gearbox, and also on this side of the motor, Suzuki's PEI, or Pointless Electronic Ignition, which in 1974 was a big step up from the old contact breaker ignition systems of the past. But these motors were very strong and very reliable. Now, one of the other relatively new innovations on these smaller Suzukis was that there was no need to mix the fuel and the oil together as a pre-mix, as Suzuki of course had their CCI oil lubrication system, whereby all of the motor's vital organs were fed their lubrication by an oil pump and a storage tank, which was usually housed just behind this right hand side panel. But you basically kept the tank topped up, and the various oil feed pipes then sent the lubrication to all of the associated bearings, etc. Although it goes without saying that these two-stroke TM motors were very quick and reliable, and in terms of working on them for the likes of servicing or repairs, they were relatively easy enough for a competent DIY mechanic to repair. And if my aging memory still functions correctly, I'm pretty sure that these little Suzukis pushed out around the 14 horsepower mark. So if you were an enthusiastic youngster back in 1974 and were riding one of these 100 TMs, then you'll already know that these had more than enough power to satisfy your need for speed. But as I said, the motors were compact, light, and very strong. Now, also back in 1974 and 75, there were still some manufacturers fitting these underslung exhaust systems onto their motocrossers, and Suzuki were certainly no different in that respect, and these exhaust systems had to comply with the local noise abatement laws in various different countries, and this rear tailpipe silencer that's fitted to our TM was not only to keep the bike's decibel level at a decent figure, but it was more than likely also a spark arrestor just to stop any sparks from its tailpipe setting fire to the landscape if they were raced in hot and dry countries. Now, once again, as you'd expect, the forks on these TM100s weren't exactly heavy duty, because this was, after all, a very small motocross machine, but they still did a decent job, and you could improve their performance by fitting stiffer springs, or maybe experimenting with different weights of fork oil, but they were still adequate for a schoolboy racer, and they did give the rider just over 6 inches of movement at the front end. Now, once again, as you can see, quite small drum brakes on our little Suzuki, but despite that, these still did their job when the bike needed to slow to make a turn, but you certainly had to plan ahead if you wanted to make an emergency stop, or maybe stand the little Suzuki on its head. But as I said, because this was a relatively light little motorcycle, these brakes coped well with every situation that was required. Now, despite the originality of our Suzuki, I'm pretty certain that these shocks here are not the originals that would have been fitted to this bike in 1974, and it more than likely would have been just a very basic set of suspension units that would have been bolted onto these bikes. But these quite radical looking shocks are a pair of red wing units, of which I know absolutely nothing about, and I've certainly never come across these kind of rear shocks before on other bikes, but I expect that these will be an upgrade on the original stock items, because they do look pretty sturdy and more than likely have a bit more scope for making some kind of adjustments. Now, once again, a quite nice sculpted fuel tank on our TM with its period correct in green and white Suzuki graphics. Now, as I remember, I think this fuel cell did hold just over 1 gallon of gas back in the day, which was more than enough to cover the shorter schoolboy races, but more importantly, it held enough fuel to feed that thirsty little 100cc two-stroke Suzuki engine. Now, as far as the bike's seat is concerned, this TM100 seat was certainly up there with some of the best of the Japanese motocrossers of its time, and in terms of its schoolboy comfort, Suzuki did design a good seat on this little 1974 rocket ship. And again, most of the bike's controls and their associated handlebars and levers and grips all look the proper Suzuki parts on this bike. And if anyone has actually restored this bike in the past, it looks like they've gone that extra mile just to make sure that the bike was authentic and correct for its year of manufacture. But it certainly is a stunning little example of one of these schoolboy racers, and it's probably a quite rare bike as well, because when was the last time that you ever saw a 74 or 75 TM100 lining up on the starting grid at a classic or vintage scramble event? But of course, these TM100s were just one model of 5 different motocrossers that Suzuki launched in 1974, because you also had the tiny TM75, the TM125, the TM250, and of course the big brother of them all, the mighty TM400. Although, once more, of course, another quality motorcycle from the Peter Maxwell collection, and as I said, I don't actually know if the bike is as it was in 1974 or if it's been restored at one time, but I'm pretty sure that you'll agree it's just great to take a look at one of these old schoolboy Suzuki TMs once again. As I said, you don't see too many going around these days, and it's thanks, of course, to my classic dirt bike TV channel that we can still continue to remember and take a look at these old school motocrossers from our past. And just imagine yourself as a teenager in 1974 and being able to ride one of these little beauties, because these TM100s did introduce many a young person into motocross racing, and some even went on to become race champions of their chosen sport. Well, there you have it, another little schoolboy racer from back in the day. That's Peter Maxwell's quite nice looking 1974 TM100 Suzuki. And if you were a young person back in the day and you did manage to ride and sling your leg over one of these little Suzukis, then you were a very lucky person indeed. So that's just about it for this episode of CDB TV, but I do hope you will come back again very soon when we talk about more of these style of vintage race bikes. So until the next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.